The blood-red sunset cast an ominous glow over Chloride, Arizona, as Jeremiah Preston burst through the saloon doors, his expensive tailored suit covered in dust, and his usually meticulously groomed blonde hair disheveled. All eyes turned toward the banker's son, known throughout the territory for getting whatever or whoever he wanted. Julia Nolan didn't even glance up from the bar where she was serving drinks, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun, a few loose tendrils framing her face. At 22, she'd learned to ignore the entitled young man's persistent advances. For 6 months, he'd been coming to her father's saloon, demanding her attention, refusing to accept that she wasn't interested. "Miss Nolan," Jeremiah called out, his voice carrying over the piano music and chatter, "I believe I've given you adequate time to consider my proposal." The piano player struck a sour note as conversation died. Julia finally looked up, her green eyes cool and steady. "Mr. Preston, as I've told you repeatedly, I'm not interested in being courted by you or anyone else at present." Jeremiah's handsome face tightened with anger. "Your reluctance is charming, but it's time to be sensible. My father owns the bank that holds the mortgage on this establishment." One word from me, a chair scraped back from a shadowed corner of the room. A tall figure stood, spurs jingling softly as he approached the bar. Marshall Neville's weathered face remained impassive beneath his worn hat, but his blue eyes were hard as steel when they fixed on Jeremiah. "Sounds like the lady gave you her answer," he said, his deep voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable authority of a man accustomed to being heeded. His hand rested casually on his holstered Colt. It was the spring of 1876, and Chloride was experiencing a silver mining boom that had brought all types to the growing town: bankers and bandits, merchants and miners, and cowboys like Marshall who worked the surrounding ranches. At 30, he'd seen enough of life to recognize men like Jeremiah Preston. Jeremiah's eyes narrowed. "This doesn't concern you, Cowboy. When a man threatens a lady in my presence, it becomes my concern," Marshall replied evenly. He wasn't looking for trouble, but he wouldn't back down from it either. Julia felt a flutter of something unfamiliar as she watched the cowboy stand his ground. In the 3 weeks since he'd started coming to the saloon, she'd noticed him quiet, observant, always polite. He tipped generously but never drank to excess, and he'd never once made her uncomfortable with unwanted attention. "My father will hear about this," Jeremiah sputtered, backing toward the door. "I'm sure he will," Marshall said, unmoved. "Just like I'm sure Miss Nolan's answer will be the same tomorrow as it is today." When Jeremiah had stormed out, the saloon erupted in murmured conversations. Julia approached Marshall with a genuine smile, the first he'd seen from her. "Thank you, Mr. Neville, though I fear you've made an enemy." "Wouldn't be my first," he replied with a slight shrug. "And please call me Marshall, only if you'll call me Julia." She refilled his coffee cup. "Are you new to Chloride? I've only noticed you these past few weeks." "Signed on with the Double R Ranch last month. Before that, I was driving cattle up from Texas." His weathered hands cradled the coffee mug. "Been a cowboy since I was 15, never really settled anywhere." Julia nodded, understanding the restlessness in his eyes. "My father and I came here after my mother died. 3 years now, he thought running a saloon would be easier than farming in Kansas." She laughed softly. "I'm not sure he was right." A call from another customer pulled her away, but Marshall felt something shift between them, the beginning of a connection he hadn't been looking for, but found himself welcoming nonetheless. The next morning, Marshall led his horse down Chloride's main street toward the general store. The town had grown rapidly since silver had been discovered in the nearby mountains, and wooden buildings now lined both sides of the dusty thoroughfare. The Double R had sent him to town for supplies, but he'd risen early, hoping to catch a glimpse of Julia before heading back to the ranch. His thoughts were interrupted by raised voices coming from the saloon. Despite the early hour, the establishment was open not for drinks, but for the small restaurant Julia's father ran in the mornings. Marshall quickened his pace, an uneasy feeling settling in his gut. Inside, he found Jeremiah Preston and an older, distinguished-looking man confronting Henry Nolan. Julia stood beside her father, her face pale but determined. "As I was explaining, Mr. Preston," Henry was saying, his voice strained but dignified, "I've never missed a payment. Your bank has no cause to foreclose." The elder Preston, clearly Jeremiah's father, adjusted his gold-rimmed spectacles. "The terms of the loan allow for an inspection of the property to ensure it's being maintained adequately. My associate reports several deficiencies." "What deficiencies?" Julia demanded. "We've repaired the roof, replaced the broken windows, and even built a new storage room." "The report cites structural concerns," the banker continued smoothly. "However, I'm prepared to be flexible if certain arrangements could be made." His gaze slid meaningfully toward Jeremiah, who was staring at Julia with undisguised possessiveness. Marshall didn't need to be a genius to understand what kind of arrangements were being suggested. "Mr. Preston," Marshall called out, stepping fully into the room. "I couldn't help overhearing. Seems to me like you're using your position to force a personal matter." Both Prestons turned, surprised by the interruption. Jeremiah's face darkened with recognition and fury. "You again, this is a private business discussion," the younger Preston snapped. Marshall approached, stopping a respectful distance from the group. "In my experience, legitimate business doesn't require coercion." The elder Preston assessed Marshall coldly. "And who might you be?" "Marshall Neville, sir. I work for the Double R." He nodded toward Henry and Julia. "The Nollans are honest people. If there are genuine concerns about the building, perhaps an independent assessment would be appropriate." "That won't be necessary," the banker replied stiffly. "But I do wonder why a ranch hand is so invested in this matter." Marshall met his gaze evenly. "I respect folks who work hard and deal fairly. Seems to me the Nollans qualify." Tension crackled in the air. Finally, the banker cleared his throat. "Very well, we'll postpone any action for 30 days to allow for improvements." He turned to leave, adding, "But make no mistake, Mr. Nollan, this matter is far from resolved." As the door closed behind the Prestons, Henry sank into a chair, his face lined with worry. "They'll find a way to take everything," he murmured. Julia touched her father's shoulder reassuringly before turning to Marshall. "You seem to make a habit of coming to our rescue." "Just happened to be passing by," he said modestly. "Well, I'm grateful." She hesitated. "Would you join us for breakfast? It's the least we can offer." Marshall accepted, and over plates of eggs and biscuits, Henry explained their situation. The saloon had been struggling when they first arrived, but business had improved steadily. The loan from Preston's bank had helped with essential repairs and upgrades. "Jeremiah started coming around 6 months ago," Julia explained, her eyes troubled. "At first he was just another customer, then he began bringing me gifts, insisting we were meant to be together." No matter how many times she refused him, Henry added, he wouldn't listen. "Now it seems he's convinced his father to help pressure her into accepting him." Marshall considered this information carefully. "The Double R does business with other banks in the territory. I could speak with my boss about helping you refinance the loan." Hope flickered in Henry's eyes. "You do that for us?" Marshall glanced at Julia, surprised by how much he wanted to help her. "It's worth a try." Over the next few days, Marshall made several trips between the Double R and Chloride. His boss, Richard Roberts, was sympathetic to the Nollans' plight but cautious about challenging the influential Preston family. "The Prestons have connections throughout the territory," Roberts warned. "Cross them, and you might find yourself unwelcome in more places than just Chloride." "I understand the risk," Marshall replied, "but what they're doing isn't right." Roberts studied his foreman thoughtfully. "Is this about justice, Marshall, or about the girl?" Marshall couldn't deny that Julia had captured his attention in a way no woman had before. There was something about her quiet strength, her dedication to her father, and yes, her beauty that drew him. But it was more than that. "It's about both," he admitted. "She deserves better than being forced into an unwanted marriage, and her father deserves a fair chance to succeed." Roberts finally nodded. "I'll speak with my banker in Prescott. No promises, but we'll see what can be done." Meanwhile, Julia found herself watching for Marshall whenever the door to the saloon opened. His visits had become more frequent, and they'd begun to learn more about each other during quiet moments between her duties. She discovered he'd been orphaned young and raised by an uncle who taught him ranching. He'd fought briefly in the final year of the Civil War despite being underage, then drifted westward, working cattle drives and taking ranch jobs. He'd never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots. Marshall, in turn, learned about Julia's childhood in Kansas, her dreams of someday having a small home of her own, and her love of reading, a passion she indulged whenever she could get her hands on books or newspapers. One evening, as the saloon was closing, Marshall offered to walk her home. The small cottage she shared with her father was just behind the saloon, but she accepted gratefully, enjoying his company. "Have you heard anything from your boss about the loan?" she asked as they strolled slowly in the moonlight. "He's made some inquiries," Marshall replied. "There's a bank in Prescott that might be willing to help, but nothing certain yet." Julia nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "We appreciate your efforts, truly. Few would bother helping strangers." "You're not strangers anymore," he said softly. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Marshall thought about taking her hand or perhaps even stealing a kiss. But the shadow of Jeremiah Preston loomed large, and he knew this wasn't the time. "Good night, Julia," he said instead, tipping his hat as they reached her door. "Good night, Marshall," she replied, a hint of longing in her voice that gave him hope. The next day brought trouble. Marshall had just finished loading supplies into the wagon when he spotted Jeremiah Preston marching down the street with two rough-looking men. They headed directly for the saloon. Marshall secured the last rope and hurried after them. Inside, he found Jeremiah confronting Henry while Julia watched anxiously from behind the bar. The two strangers were examining the building, tapping on walls and support beams. "As you can see," Jeremiah was saying smugly, "our inspectors have identified serious structural flaws. We're concerned the building might collapse, endangering patrons." "These men aren't building inspectors," Henry protested. "They're hired thugs." One of the men turned, his hand moving to his gun. "Careful who you're calling thugs, old man," Marshall stepped forward. "Everything all right here, Henry?" Jeremiah's expression soured. "The cowboy again. Don't you have cows to chase somewhere?" "I could ask if you don't have a bank to help run, but I suspect your father keeps you away from anything important," Marshall replied calmly. Jeremiah's face reddened. "I'll have you know I'm being groomed to take over the entire Preston banking enterprise. My father has already put me in charge of managing several accounts, including this pitiful establishment's loan." "Then maybe you should conduct yourself with more professionalism," Marshall suggested. "We're simply enforcing the terms of our agreement," Jeremiah insisted. "These gentlemen are here to assess the building's safety." One of the men spoke up, his voice gravelly. "And I'm finding plenty wrong. Beams looking weak, floor not level, could be dangerous." Marshall approached the man. "Mind if I take a look at your credentials?" "Most building inspectors I've met carry certification from the territory." The man hesitated, glancing at Jeremiah, who intervened quickly. "The bank doesn't need official inspectors. We're entitled to protect our investment however we see fit." "That's not how the law works," Marshall countered. "And I believe Sheriff Tanner would agree." The mention of the sheriff caused a subtle shift in the room. Jeremiah's confidence faltered briefly before he regained his composure. "This isn't over," he warned, motioning for his men to follow him out. "You have 1 week to address these issues or we'll have no choice but to foreclose." After they left, Henry sank onto a bar stool. "They'll find a way to take everything," he said, echoing his words from their previous confrontation. "Not if we stop them first," Marshall assured him. "I'm heading to Prescott tomorrow to meet with the banker Mr. Roberts contacted. With luck, we'll have an alternative arrangement before Jeremiah can act." Julia came around the bar and, to Marshall's surprise, took his hand. "Thank you," she said simply, her green eyes luminous with emotion. The journey to Prescott took Marshall a full day. The territorial capital was larger and more established than Chloride, with proper buildings of brick and stone lining its streets. Marshall felt out of place in his trail-worn clothes, but he was determined to make a good impression on the banker. Walter Simmons of the First Bank of Prescott was a practical man who listened attentively as Marshall explained the situation. His shrewd eyes evaluated Marshall as much as the business proposition. The Nolan establishment sounds reasonably profitable, Simmons acknowledged. But challenging Abraham Preston is risky. His influence extends beyond Chloride. All we're asking for is a fair assessment, Marshall replied. If the saloon qualifies for a loan on its own merits, Preston's personal vendetta shouldn't matter. Simmons tapped his fingers on his desk. I'll send someone to evaluate the property legitimately. If everything checks out, we might be able to help. But you understand this puts Mr. Roberts in a potentially uncomfortable position as well, Marshall nodded. He's aware of the implications. The banker studied him. You're taking considerable risk yourself. May I ask why? Marshall considered how to answer. Let's just say I recognize injustice when I see it. Simmons smiled slightly. And the fact that Miss Nolan is reportedly quite beautiful has nothing to do with it. Marshall didn't deny it. She deserves the right to choose her own path. Very well, Simmons agreed. My associate will be in Chloride within the week. I suggest you ensure the Prestons don't create any incidents before then. When Marshall returned to Chloride 2 days later, he was greeted by a disturbing sight. A small crowd had gathered outside the saloon, where Julia was arguing heatedly with Jeremiah Preston. Between them stood Sheriff Tanner, looking uncomfortable. What's happening? Marshall asked a bystander as he dismounted. Preston's trying to get the sheriff to close down the saloon, the man explained. Claims it's unsafe after some fight broke out last night. Marshall pushed through the crowd. Julia's face brightened with relief when she saw him. Marshall, thank goodness you're back. Sheriff Tanner turned. Neville, maybe you can help sort this out. Jeremiah glared at Marshall. There's nothing to sort out. A brawl last night damaged several support beams. The building is unsafe and should be closed immediately. That's not what happened, Julia insisted. Two men started fighting men I've never seen before. They seemed more interested in damaging the bar than each other. Marshall immediately understood. Hired troublemakers, Jeremiah scoffed. That's an outrageous accusation, is it? Marshall turned to the sheriff. Seems convenient that strangers appear, cause specific damage, and disappear just when Preston is looking for reasons to foreclose. Sheriff Tanner sighed heavily. He was an older man who preferred quiet days to conflicts between powerful citizens. I can't prove anything about who started the fight, but I do need to determine if the building is safe. Then let's get an impartial assessment, Marshall suggested. Someone not connected to the Prestons. There's no need, Jeremiah began, but the sheriff cut him off. Actually, that's reasonable. Doc Williams has some building experience. Let's have him take a look. Jeremiah could hardly object without appearing suspicious. While they waited for the doctor, Marshall quietly told Julia about his meeting in Prescott. If we can hold them off for just a few more days, he murmured, help will come. Her hand found his again, squeezing gratefully. I don't know what we would have done without you, Marshall. The doctor's inspection revealed minor damage that was easily reparable, nothing that warranted closing the establishment. Jeremiah was furious, but had no grounds to press the issue further with the sheriff present. This isn't over, he hissed at Marshall before storming away. I believe you, Marshall replied evenly, but neither are we. That evening, Marshall helped Henry repair the damaged portions of the bar. As they worked, Henry studied the younger man with thoughtful eyes. You've done more for us than we could have expected from anyone, he said as they fitted a new support beam. Especially a man just passing through, Marshall paused, considering his words carefully. I'm not sure I am just passing through anymore, Henry nodded slowly. I've seen how you look at my daughter, and how she looks at you when she thinks no one's noticing. Marshall felt his neck warm. I respect Julia greatly. She's unlike anyone I've met. She's had suitors before, Henry continued, hammering a nail with perhaps more force than necessary. None of them saw her. They saw a pretty face, not the strong, intelligent woman she is. Marshall met the older man's gaze. I see her, Henry's expression softened. I believe you do. He set down his hammer. Just remember, whatever happens with Preston, Julia makes her own choices, always has. I wouldn't want it any other way, Marshall assured him. They finished the repairs late into the night. When Julia brought them coffee, her hand lingered on Marshall's as she passed him the cup, her eyes conveying what words couldn't yet express. The next few days passed in tense anticipation. Marshall split his time between duties at the Double R and helping at the saloon, where business had actually improved as locals rallied behind the Nolans after hearing about Preston's tactics. 4 days after Marshall's return from Prescott, a well-dressed stranger arrived on the afternoon stage. He introduced himself as James Harrington, representative of the First Bank of Prescott. His inspection of the saloon was thorough and professional. "The establishment appears to be in good condition and demonstrably profitable," he told Henry after reviewing the books. "Based on my assessment, I believe my bank would be willing to refinance your loan and pay off your debt to Preston." Relief washed over Henry's face. "That would be a godsend, sir." "I'll wire Mr. Simmons today," Harrington assured him. "With any luck, we can have the paperwork completed within the week." The news spread quickly through Chloride's gossip network. By evening, most townspeople knew the Nolans had found a way to escape Preston's grip. When Jeremiah burst into the saloon that night, his usually impeccable appearance was disheveled, his eyes wild. "Is it true?" he demanded, confronting Julia at the bar. "You're going to refinance with Prescott," she stood her ground. "Our business arrangements aren't your concern, Mr. Preston." "Everything about you is my concern," he shouted, drawing stares from the patrons. "I've made my intentions clear. I've been patient. I've been generous. You've been controlling and threatening," Julia corrected him calmly. "And I've made my feelings equally clear." Jeremiah slammed his fist on the bar. "My father will never allow this. One word from him to the bank in Prescott won't matter," Marshall interrupted, approaching from where he'd been sitting with several Double R cowhands. "First Bank of Prescott doesn't answer to your father." Jeremiah spun to face him, hatred burning in his eyes. You've been behind this from the start," Marshall shrugged. "I just helped connect people who could help each other. Miss Nolan and her father found their own solution." "You think you've won?" Jeremiah snarled, his hand moving toward his coat pocket. "But I always get what I want." Marshall tensed, ready to move if Jeremiah drew a weapon. The banker's son was clearly unhinged with rage and wounded pride. "Not this time," Julia said firmly, coming around the bar to stand beside Marshall. "I suggest you leave now while you can do so with dignity." For a moment, the saloon was silent, everyone watching to see what Jeremiah would do. His hand remained near his pocket, his breathing ragged. "This isn't over," he finally spat, not by a long shot. After he stormed out, the tension in the room gradually dissipated. Marshall turned to Julia, concern evident in his eyes. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. "I've never seen him that angry." "I'm worried about what he might do next." "I don't think he'll risk anything in town with so many witnesses," Marshall reassured her. "But maybe I should stay close tonight, just to be safe." Henry agreed, and Marshall settled in for a vigil on the small porch of their cottage. The night passed quietly, but Marshall couldn't shake his unease. Jeremiah Preston wasn't a man accustomed to losing. His instincts proved correct the following afternoon. Marshall was helping unload supplies at the general store when he heard shouting from the direction of the saloon. Dropping what he was doing, he ran toward the commotion. Smoke was pouring from the back of the building. People were rushing to form a bucket brigade from the town well as flames began to lick at the wooden structure. "Julia, Henry," Marshall shouted, pushing through the gathering crowd. "Henry's inside," someone called. Went back for the strongbox. Without hesitation, Marshall plunged into the smoke-filled saloon. The fire had started in the storage room at the back, but was spreading rapidly. He found Henry near the bar, coughing violently as he struggled with a heavy metal box. "Come on," Marshall grabbed Henry's arm, pulling him toward the door. "Leave it." "Can't," Henry gasped. "All our savings documents for the bank, understanding the importance." Marshall took the box. "I've got it. Move." They stumbled out into the sunlight just as part of the roof collapsed behind them. Julia rushed forward, tears streaming down her face as she embraced her father. "I thought I'd lost you," she sobbed. Henry coughed harshly but managed to pat her back reassuringly. I'm all right, daughter. The town's impromptu fire brigade worked desperately to contain the blaze, but it was clear the saloon couldn't be saved. By sundown, only smoldering ruins remained of what had been the Nollans' livelihood and home. As they stood staring at the destruction, Sheriff Tanner approached. His expression was grim. Found evidence of coal oil around the back door. This was deliberate. Preston, Marshall said flatly. The sheriff nodded. Most likely, but proving it will be difficult. No one saw anything. Julia wiped tears from her cheeks. What do we do now? Even if the Prescott Bank approves the loan, we have nothing left to save. Henry put his arm around her shoulders. We'll rebuild somehow. You can stay at the Double R for now, Marshall offered. I'll speak with Mr. Roberts. We have a small cabin no one's using. Later that evening, after settling the Nollans at the ranch, Marshall rode back into town, determination hardening his features. He tied his horse outside the sheriff's office and found Tanner at his desk. Any progress on finding who set the fire? He asked without preamble. Tanner leaned back in his chair, looking tired. Jeremiah Preston and his father both claim they were at the bank all afternoon. They have witnesses, bank employees who work for them. Convenient, Marshall observed. Indeed. The sheriff studied Marshall carefully. I know what you're thinking, but don't. Taking matters into your own hands will only end badly. Marshall remained silent, neither confirming nor denying the sheriff's assumption. The Prestons have always operated just within the law, Tanner continued. They're careful about that. If you move against them without proof, you'll be the one in my jail. Marshall nodded slowly. I understand, Sheriff. Just want justice, that's all. Justice comes in many forms, Tanner replied cryptically. Sometimes patience is the best strategy. As Marshall turned to leave, the sheriff added, By the way, I heard a rumor that Abraham Preston will be traveling to Phoenix next week. Banking business, apparently. Jeremiah will be handling things here alone. Their eyes met in silent communication before Marshall tipped his hat and departed. The next few days were busy as the Nollans adjusted to their temporary home at the Double R. Julia, always practical, found ways to make herself useful around the ranch, helping the cook and mending clothes for the cowhands. Henry, still recovering from smoke inhalation, spent most of his time resting and planning how they might rebuild. Marshall divided his attention between ranch work and gathering information in town. He learned that Abraham Preston would indeed be leaving for Phoenix on Friday's stage, expected to be gone for at least 10 days. More importantly, he discovered through one of the bank clerks that Jeremiah had been skimming small amounts from various accounts for months, including the Nollans. On Thursday evening, Marshall found Julia sitting alone on the porch of the cabin, watching the sunset. Her auburn hair was loose around her shoulders, catching the golden light. He thought she'd never looked more beautiful. May I join you? He asked softly. She smiled and patted the bench beside her. Of course. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before she spoke. Father's been talking about moving on, maybe to Prescott or even California. Marshall felt a sudden hollowness in his chest. Is that what you want? She turned to look at him, her green eyes searching his face. I don't know anymore. A week ago I might have said yes. Chloride was just a place we ended up, not somewhere I chose. And now her gaze dropped to her hands, folded in her lap. Now I wonder if there might be reasons to stay, despite everything. Hope flickered in Marshall's heart. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and took her hand. I think there might be, he said quietly. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers intertwined with his. Marshall, what are you planning to do about Jeremiah? The question caught him off guard. What makes you think I'm planning anything? I see how you look when his name is mentioned, like you're calculating something, Marshall sighed. He shouldn't have been surprised by her perceptiveness. I've learned some things about the Prestons' banking practices, things that could cause them considerable trouble if they became public. Alarm flashed across her face. You're not thinking of confronting him directly? He's dangerous, especially now. I know, Marshall assured her. But this might be our best chance to ensure he never threatens you again. She squeezed his hand. Promise me you'll be careful. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because of us. The genuine concern in her voice touched him deeply. Impulsively, he leaned forward and pressed his lips gently to hers. The kiss was brief but tender, a promise of deeper feelings neither had fully expressed. When he pulled back, her eyes remained closed for a moment, her lips slightly parted. Then she looked at him with such warmth that words seemed unnecessary. "I promise," he whispered. Friday morning dawned clear and bright. Marshall watched from a distance as Abraham Preston boarded the Phoenix-bound stage, his last instructions to his son clearly audible across the street. "Handle things properly while I'm gone," the elder Preston admonished. "No impulsive decisions." "Yes, father," Jeremiah replied, his tone respectful but his expression sullen once his father's back was turned. Marshall waited until afternoon before making his move. He entered the bank dressed in his best clothes, which weren't much by town standards, but made him look less like a dusty cowhand. Jeremiah was at his father's desk, clearly enjoying the temporary authority. His smug expression faltered when he spotted Marshall. "The bank is about to close for the day," he said sharply. "Whatever business you have will have to wait until Monday." Marshall closed the door behind him. "This won't take long. I'd like to discuss some discrepancies I've noticed in the Nolan account." Jeremiah's eyes narrowed. "I don't discuss client matters with unrelated parties." "That's commendable," Marshall agreed, approaching the desk. "But I'm curious about why funds from their account were transferred to your personal holdings, and not just theirs." The color drained from Jeremiah's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." Marshall placed a folded paper on the desk. "This says otherwise. Your clerk, Mr. Thompson, has been keeping quite detailed records. Seems he was concerned about explaining the shortfalls to your father." Jeremiah stared at the paper but didn't touch it. "Thompson will be fired immediately. For documenting fraud, I'm not sure the Territorial Banking Commission would view that favorably." Marshall's tone remained conversational, but his eyes were hard. "Nor would your father, I imagine." "What do you want?" Jeremiah hissed, dropping all pretense. "3 things." Marshall held up one finger. "First, you'll sign over the deed to the Nolan property, what's left of it free and clear." A second finger joined the first. "Second, you'll provide compensation for the destruction of their business and home." A third finger rose. "And third, you'll leave Julia alone, permanently." Jeremiah's laugh was bitter. "Or what? You'll tell my father I've been creative with the bookkeeping. He might be angry, but he'll protect me. The Prestons stick together." "I wasn't thinking of your father," Marshall replied calmly. "I was thinking of Sheriff Tanner and the Territorial Marshal. Banking fraud is a serious offense." "You're bluffing," Jeremiah challenged, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Marshall shrugged. "Maybe, but consider what you stand to lose if I'm not. Your father's respect, your freedom. Your future." The stalemate stretched for several tense moments. Finally, Jeremiah's shoulders sagged slightly. "The property deed I can arrange. Compensation will be more difficult without explaining to my father." "I'm sure you'll find a way," Marshall pressed. "Perhaps from the same accounts you've been skimming from, only this time you'll record it properly as restitution." Jeremiah's jaw tightened with hatred, but he nodded stiffly. "And in return, you'll destroy that document and never speak of this again." "Once the Nolans have what they're owed," Marshall confirmed, "and as long as you keep your distance from Julia." "She was never worth this much trouble anyway," Jeremiah muttered, though his eyes betrayed his lingering obsession. "Then we have an agreement." Marshall extended his hand, forcing Jeremiah to either shake or openly refuse. After a moment's hesitation, Jeremiah briefly clasped Marshall's hand. "I'll have the papers drawn up by tomorrow. The compensation will take a few days to arrange without raising questions." "I'll be watching," Marshall warned as he turned to leave. "Any tricks and Mr. Thompson's records go straight to the authorities." When Marshall returned to the Double R that evening, he found Julia waiting anxiously. Her face lit up with relief when she saw him unharmed. "What happened?" she asked as they walked toward the creek that ran behind the ranch buildings. He explained the confrontation and the agreement, watching her expression shift from concern to disbelief. "You actually got him to agree, without violence." She shook her head wonderingly. "I never thought Jeremiah would back down for any reason." "Self-preservation is a powerful motivator," Marshall observed. "He has too much to lose." Julia stopped walking and turned to face him. I don't know how to thank you. You've done more for us than anyone ever has. Marshall took both her hands in his. I didn't do it for thanks, Julia. I did it because… He paused, gathering his courage. Because I care for you more than I've cared for anyone. Her eyes glistened with emotion. I care for you too. These past weeks, despite everything, have been special to me. This time when they kissed, it was deeper, more certain. Marshall's arms encircled her waist as hers wound around his neck. When they finally parted, both were breathless. What happens now? She asked softly. That depends, he replied. Your father mentioned California. She shook her head. I don't want to leave, not anymore. Hope surged through him. The Double R has a foreman's house that's been empty since the last man left. Mr. Roberts has hinted it could be mine if I wanted to settle permanently. It's small, but it sounds perfect, she interrupted, her smile radiant. In the days that followed, Jeremiah Preston kept his word, though clearly under duress. The deed to the Nolan property was transferred without encumbrances, and a substantial sum appeared as a banking error correction in their account at the Prescott Bank. Henry decided to rebuild the saloon, but on a smaller scale, focusing more on the restaurant aspect that had always been Julia's preferred part of the business. With Marshall's help and contributions from townspeople who had come to respect the Nolans, work progressed rapidly. As promised, Mr. Roberts offered Marshall the permanent position of foreman, along with the small but comfortable house near the main ranch buildings. Marshall accepted without hesitation, his days of drifting finally behind him. 3 months after the fire, on a perfect autumn day, Marshall and Julia were married in a simple ceremony at the newly completed Nolan restaurant. Sheriff Tanner stood as witness, along with several cowboys from the Double R and townspeople who had become friends. Henry, looking healthier than he had in years, proudly walked his daughter down the makeshift aisle. When asked who gave this woman, he replied with a catch in his voice, I do, but only because she chooses it. As they exchanged vows, Marshall marveled at how his life had changed since that first confrontation in the saloon. He had come to Chloride looking for nothing more than temporary work, never imagining he would find a home, a purpose, and a love he hadn't known he was seeking. When Abraham Preston returned from Phoenix, he was furious about the arrangements his son had made in his absence. But faced with the evidence of Jeremiah's financial improprieties, he chose to accept the situation rather than risk public scandal. Within a month, he had sent Jeremiah to manage a bank branch in California as far from Chloride as practical. Life settled into a pleasant rhythm for the newlyweds. Marshall divided his time between ranch duties and helping Henry with the restaurant. Julia thrived as the establishment's manager, creating a welcoming place known for good food and honest dealings. By the following spring, Julia was expecting their first child. Marshall had never known such happiness or such purpose. The night she told him about the baby, they sat on the porch of their small home, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. Did you ever imagine this would be your life? She asked, leaning against his shoulder. Never, he admitted. I always thought I'd keep moving, never staying anywhere long enough to matter. And now, he kissed her forehead tenderly, now I can't imagine being anywhere but here with you. This is where I belong. 5 years later, Chloride had grown into a proper town. The silver mines continued to produce, bringing prosperity to the area. The Nolan restaurant had expanded again, becoming one of the most respected establishments in the territory. Henry had largely retired, though he still greeted customers most days from his favorite table near the window. Marshall and Julia's home had expanded too, with the addition of a new wing to accommodate their growing family, 4-year-old Henry James Neville and 2-year-old twins, Rebecca and Robert. On a warm summer evening, as they watched their children playing in the yard, Julia squeezed her husband's hand. Remember when we worried Jeremiah Preston would destroy everything? Marshall nodded, his thumb caressing her fingers where their hands joined. Seems like another lifetime. In a way it was, she mused. Sometimes the worst things lead to the best outcomes. News had reached them occasionally about Jeremiah. He had married a banker's daughter in San Francisco and seemed to have found his place in California society, his obsession with Julia apparently forgotten. "Do you ever regret settling down with a simple cowboy?" Marshall asked, only half joking. Even after 5 years of marriage, part of him still marveled that this extraordinary woman had chosen him. Julia turned to face him, her green eyes as bright and beautiful as the day they'd met. "Never. Not for a single moment." She leaned forward to kiss him. "You weren't just a cowboy, Marshall. You were the man who wouldn't let injustice stand. The man who really saw me when no one else did." Little Henry ran up to them then, proudly displaying a small wooden horse Marshall had carved for him. "Papa, look, he can jump fences." Marshall lifted his son onto his lap. "Is that so? Show me how." As he watched his son demonstrate the horse's imaginary jumping abilities, with Julia beside him and the twins now toddling over to join them, Marshall reflected on the strange turns life could take. A chance encounter in a saloon, a banker's son who wouldn't take no for an answer. A stand against injustice that had led to unexpected love. Their story had begun with conflict but had blossomed into something beautiful and enduring. In the wilds of the Arizona Territory, where fortunes could change in an instant and dangers lurked around every corner, they had found something precious. A love worth fighting for and a future built together. Later that night, with their children asleep and the house quiet around them, Marshall held Julia close in their bed, grateful for every circumstance, good and bad, that had brought them to this moment. "I love you," he whispered against her hair, "more with each passing day." "And I love you," she replied, nestling closer. "My cowboy who made sure everyone understood that some things aren't for sale, not for any price." Outside, the stars shone over Chloride, over the ranch, over the life they had built from adversity and courage. The banker's son had finally understood. The cowboy had found his home. And their love story, begun in defiance, continued in joy, a testament to the power of standing firm for what matters most.